Imagine the smell of stale beer, cheap perfume, and burning pyrotechnics hanging heavy in the air of a Midwestern arena in the mid-1970s. The crowd is a restless, surging ocean of denim and leather, deafened by the sheer volume of a rock band that looks less like traditional musicians and more like comic book villains brought to terrifying, glorious life. This was the golden era of stadium rock, a time when the music industry was flush with cash, fueled by excess, and driven by a relentless, almost desperate pursuit of the next big thing. But behind the curtain of this larger-than-life spectacle, behind the fire-breathing, the blood-spitting, the levitating drum kits, and the towering wall of amplifiers, there is a story of absolute, pure desperation. It is a story of a record label on the very brink of total financial collapse, a manager funding a national concert tour out of his own pocket using personal credit cards, and a band that was dangerously close to becoming a forgotten footnote in the annals of rock history. This is the definitive story of how a desperate gamble, the genius of a legendary audio engineer, and a massive, audaciously executed lie created one of the greatest, most influential rock and roll albums of all time. It is the story of how the illusion of reality was meticulously crafted in a darkened recording studio in New York City, ultimately saving a multi-million-dollar company from total bankruptcy and catapulting four guys from the streets of Queens into global, unprecedented superstardom. Let me take you back to 1975, to a specific moment in time when the raw truth was willingly sacrificed on the altar of pure entertainment, and absolutely no one cared because the final product was just too incredible, too visceral, to ignore. To truly understand the sheer gravity of this situation, you have to understand the mind of Neil Bogart and the perilous state of Casablanca Records. Neil Bogart was not your typical suit-and-tie record executive. He was a flamboyant visionary, a gambler who believed that perception was just as important, if not more so, than reality. He had cut his teeth in the music business promoting bubblegum pop hits in the late 60s and early 70s, but his ultimate dream was to build his own empire. In 1973, he founded Casablanca Records, naming it after the classic Humphrey Bogart film, signaling his grand cinematic ambitions. He initially secured financial backing from the massive Warner Brothers Corporation, and he spent money like it was going out of style. Bogart wanted the music industry to view Casablanca as a powerhouse from day one. He threw lavish, legendarily extravagant parties, drove luxury cars, and famously decorated his Los Angeles office to look like a set from the movie, complete with palm trees and, at one point, a live camel. But all the smoke and mirrors in the world could not hide the terrifying truth in the accounting ledgers. By early 1975, Casablanca Records had failed to produce a consistent string of massive hit records. The label was bleeding cash at an alarming rate. Warner Brothers, tired of Bogart's unchecked spending and lack of return on investment, severed ties with the label. Suddenly, Casablanca was independent, isolated, and reportedly saddled with millions of dollars in crippling debt. Bogart was literally keeping the lights on by shuffling money between personal credit cards. He needed a miracle. He needed a massive, undeniable hit, and he needed it immediately, or the entire empire he had dreamed of would crumble into dust. Enter four young, incredibly hungry musicians from New York City who called themselves KISS. Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Ace Frehley, and Peter Criss had formed the band with a very specific, highly calculated vision. They looked at the rock scene, which at the time was dominated by introverted singer-songwriters looking at their shoes while they played, and they decided to go in the exact opposite direction. They wanted to be the band they never saw on stage. They adopted extreme alter egos: the demon, the star child, the spaceman, and the catman. They painted their faces with stark black and white kabuki-style makeup, strapped on 7-inch leather platform boots, and designed a live show that was more akin to a dangerous, high-octane circus than a traditional concert. Their live performances were already becoming legendary across the country. They breathed actual fire, smashed guitars, set off military-grade pyrotechnics, and played with a ferocious, aggressive energy that whipped audiences into an absolute frenzy. But there was a massive, frustrating disconnect that was slowly killing their career. While their live shows were selling out theaters and leaving fans speechless, their studio albums were commercial failures. Their first 3 records, simply titled Kiss, Hotter Than Hell, and Dressed to Kill, completely failed to capture the thunderous power of their stage presence. In the sterile environment of a recording studio, Stripped of the fire, the lights, and the screaming fans, their music sounded thin, flat, and surprisingly lifeless. The critics dismissed them as a pathetic visual gimmick, a joke band hiding behind makeup because they lacked actual musical talent. Despite their growing underground cult following, their record sales were abysmal. They were working harder than any band in America, touring relentlessly, but they were barely surviving financially. The situation reached a critical breaking point during the Dress to Kill tour in the middle of 1975. The band's fiercely loyal and incredibly dedicated manager, Bill Aucoin, believed in their potential so deeply that he was literally risking his own financial future to keep them on the road. With Casablanca Records essentially broke and unable to provide tour support, Aucoin was funding their travel, their extravagant costumes, and their dangerous pyrotechnics by maxing out his personal American Express card to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was a completely unsustainable house of cards. Everyone involved knew that if the next album was not a massive, undeniable commercial success, it was over. The band would have to take off the makeup and find regular jobs, Aucoin would be bankrupted, and Casablanca Records would fold completely. In this atmosphere of suffocating desperation, an unconventional and highly risky idea emerged. Studio time was incredibly expensive, costing hundreds of dollars an hour, money that nobody had. But what if they could bypass the sterile studio entirely? What if they could just record one of their explosive live shows and release that? Today, live albums are a standard part of any major band's discography, but in 1975, the music industry viewed live records very differently. With a few rare exceptions, live albums were considered cheap, throwaway products, often released merely to fulfill contractual obligations, or as a stopgap measure between proper studio releases. They notoriously suffered from terrible audio quality and rarely sold well. But Neil Bogart did not care about industry conventions. He looked at the ledgers, saw that recording a few live shows would cost a fraction of what a full studio album would cost, and realized it might be their only chance to finally capture the elusive lightning in a bottle that made the band so special. It was a Hail Mary pass in the final seconds of the game. To execute this desperate plan, Bogart knew they needed someone behind the recording console who understood how to capture heavy, aggressive rock music. He reached out to Eddie Kramer, a legendary audio engineer and producer whose resume was nothing short of staggering. Kramer was the man who had shaped the sound of rock gods. He had worked extensively with Jimi Hendrix, engineered legendary sessions for Led Zeppelin, and helped define the sonic landscape of the Woodstock generation. If anyone could wrangle the chaotic, deafening noise of this particular band into something listenable, it was Kramer. The plan was relatively straightforward on paper. They would hire a mobile recording truck, follow the band for a few dates on the Midwestern leg of their tour, roll tape, and capture the magic. They targeted specific shows in cities where the band had built a rabid following: Detroit, Michigan at the famous Cobo Hall, Cleveland, Ohio, Davenport, Iowa, and Wildwood, New Jersey. The excitement was palpable. The band knew this was a monumental opportunity, perhaps their last, to prove their worth to the world. When they hit the stage at Cobo Hall in May of 1975, they played with the frantic, desperate energy of men fighting for their lives. The crowd response was deafening, a visceral wall of human noise that validated everything the band had worked for. From the audience's perspective, the shows were absolute triumphs, legendary nights of pure rock and roll escapism. The visual spectacle was flawless. The energy was unmatched. The fans went home exhausted and ecstatic, convinced they had witnessed history. But the reality lurking inside the remote recording truck parked out in the alley behind the arenas was a completely different, deeply horrifying story. When the tour ended and Eddie Kramer finally sat down in a proper control room to listen to the miles of heavy magnetic tape they had recorded, the atmosphere instantly turned from hopeful to utterly devastated. The audio was, to put it mildly, an absolute disaster. The very things that made the band's live show so incredibly captivating visually were the exact things that absolutely destroyed the audio recording. In the mid-70s, capturing high-fidelity sound in a massive, echoing concrete arena was already an incredibly difficult technical challenge, but this band made it nearly impossible. They never stood still. They were constantly running across the massive stage, jumping off drum risers, and throwing themselves to their knees. Because of this relentless, chaotic movement, the singers were constantly moving their heads away from the microphones, resulting in vocal tracks that faded in and out wildly, missed cues, and breathless, off-key shouting. The instruments fared even worse. The massive, dangerous pyrotechnics they used on stage generated intense, sudden waves of extreme heat. This extreme temperature fluctuation wreaked absolute havoc on the wooden instruments and metal strings, throwing the electric guitars and basses completely out of tune halfway through the first song. On top of that, the band's sheer adrenaline led to rushed tempos, sloppy playing, incredibly missed chords, and jarring musical mistakes that were easily forgiven by a screaming audience caught up in the moment, but which sounded absolutely brutal and amateurish when isolated on a pair of high-end studio monitors. Kramer listened to the tapes and knew immediately that releasing this raw, unedited audio would be professional suicide. It would confirm every terrible thing the critics had ever said about them. It would not save the record label. It would be the final, massive nail in the coffin. A monumental, high-stakes meeting took place. The band, the management, and the producer sat down to face the brutal, undeniable truth. The live tapes were simply unusable as they were. But the deadline was looming. The label was still starving for cash, and abandoning the project was simply not an option. They could not afford to go back on the road and try to record again. They were trapped. It was in this crucible of sheer panic that the fateful, highly controversial decision was made. If they could not release the actual live performance, they would simply have to manufacture one. They would have to build the perfect live album from the ground up, inside the highly controlled, sterile environment of a recording studio, and present it to the world as an authentic documentary recording. The location chosen for this grand musical deception was fittingly legendary. Electric Lady Studios in the heart of Greenwich Village in New York City, a world-class facility originally built by Jimi Hendrix himself. In August of 1975, the band quietly slipped into the studio, far away from the screaming crowds, the explosions, and the flashing lights, to meticulously rewrite their own history. The philosophical shift was profound. They were no longer trying to document a specific moment in time. They were now tasked with engineering a feeling. They had to scientifically dissect the chaotic energy of their live show and painstakingly reconstruct it using studio trickery, all while maintaining the vital illusion that it was happening spontaneously on a stage in front of thousands of people. It was an audacious, incredibly risky undertaking. If the public or the music press found out they were faking a live album, the backlash could destroy whatever shred of credibility they had left. But desperate times required desperate, incredibly creative measures. The process of creating this artificial live experience was painstaking, tedious, and required incredible discipline. In modern times, fixing a mistake on a live recording takes a few clicks of a mouse using digital software. You can nudge a vocal into perfect pitch or align a drum beat instantly. But in 1975, audio manipulation was a highly physical, labor-intensive analog process. They were working with heavy 2-inch magnetic tape. Fixing a mistake meant a process called punching in. A musician would have to play along with the existing track, and at the exact millisecond the mistake occurred, the engineer would physically hit a button to record over the bad note, then instantly punch out before erasing the next good note. It required immense precision and timing. As they began dissecting the multi-track tapes from the Detroit and Cleveland shows, they realized the sheer scope of the necessary repairs. The rhythm guitars were too sloppy, so Paul Stanley sat in a quiet isolation booth, plugged his guitar directly into the pristine studio mixing console, and completely re-recorded his parts, carefully trying to mimic the aggressive, adrenaline-fueled strumming he used on stage. The bass lines were lost in the muddy arena acoustics and distortion, so Gene Simmons had to methodically retrace his entire performance, note by note, in the dead silence of the studio, to give the album the heavy, driving bottom end it desperately needed. The lead guitar solos, originally marred by out-of-tune strings and missed notes, were wiped completely clean. Ace Frehley stood in the studio and flawlessly recreated his wild, iconic solos, adding a level of polish and technical proficiency that simply did not exist on the original arena tapes. The vocal tracks required an equally intense level of doctoring. Because the stage performances were so physically demanding, the original live vocals were breathless, strained, and often painfully flat. The singers had to stand perfectly still in front of highly sensitive, expensive studio condenser microphones and completely re-sing their parts from top to bottom. They had to consciously act, injecting fake excitement, heavy breathing, and artificial grit into their voices to make it sound like they were running around a massive stage rather than standing in a carpeted room. When the dust finally settled on the grueling studio sessions, a staggering truth emerged. Of the original recordings captured in those Midwestern arenas, almost nothing of the actual musical performance remained intact. According to later admissions by both the band members and the producer, the only major musical element that survived the massive studio purge was the drum tracks. Peter Criss's frantic, heavy-hitting drum performance was largely left alone, not necessarily out of a desire for purity, but because of a technical limitation. In a live setting, the extremely loud sound of the drums bleeds into every other open microphone on the stage. You cannot easily replace a drum track without the original beat haunting the background of all the other instruments. So, the drums remained as the sole authentic anchor to the actual live shows, a foundational heartbeat upon which a completely fabricated musical masterpiece was meticulously constructed. The guitars, the bass, the lead vocals, the backing harmonies, all of it was a carefully constructed studio illusion, a perfect, polished reproduction of what the band wished they sounded like on their very best night. But replacing the music was only half the battle. A live album is nothing without the audience. The crowd is essentially the fifth member of the band, providing the crucial context, the massive scale, and the emotional validation that makes a live recording feel important. The raw audio of the crowds captured in the arenas was impressive, but it was uneven. There were dead spots, moments of quiet between songs, and the overall volume didn't sound quite big enough to match the epic, towering sound the band was currently building in the studio. Eddie Kramer knew that to sell the illusion, to make the listener feel like they were standing in the middle of a colossal, earth-shattering event, he had to completely manipulate the audience noise. He took stereo recordings of crowd reactions from various different concerts, isolated the absolute best moments, the most rabid, deafening cheers, the piercing whistles, the explosive roars at the start of a song, and he created physical tape loops. He literally cut sections of magnetic tape with a razor blade and taped the ends together so they would play in a continuous, never-ending circle on the tape machine. He then carefully mixed this artificial, constantly roaring super crowd underneath the studio-recorded music. He used mixing desk faders to swell the crowd noise during guitar solos, to make them roar louder at the end of a vocal phrase, and to create an atmosphere of relentless, unbroken hysteria. He essentially orchestrated the audience like an instrument. When you listen to the album, the crowd sounds less like a few thousand teenagers in a Midwestern hockey arena, and more like a massive, terrifying army of absolute fanatics screaming for their lives. It was a masterclass in psychological audio engineering. In September of 1975, the final product was unleashed upon the world as a massive double vinyl record set, simply titled "Alive!" The packaging was brilliant. The front cover featured a spectacular, chaotic photograph of the band on stage, engulfed in smoke and bright stage lights, visually promising the ultimate rock and roll experience. Inside the heavy cardboard gatefold sleeve, there were handwritten notes from each band member to the fans, creating a deep sense of personal connection and intimacy. From the moment the needle hit the groove of the first track, Deuce, listeners were instantly blown away. It sounded completely massive. It possessed the raw, dangerous, uncontrollable attitude of a live concert, but with the massive, punchy, crystal-clear audio fidelity of a million-dollar studio production. It was, quite literally, the best of both worlds. At first, the album sold steadily to their existing cult fan base, but then the label made a brilliant strategic move. They pulled the live version of the song Rock and Roll All Night, complete with the roaring, manufactured crowd noise and an explosive guitar solo, and released it as a standalone radio single. The song became an absolute cultural phenomenon. It was an unstoppable, anthemic battle cry for rebellious youth across the nation. The single rocketed up the Billboard charts, dragging the massive double album right up with it. The gamble had paid off in ways nobody could have possibly imagined in their wildest dreams. The commercial success of the album was staggering and completely unprecedented for the band. It stayed on the Billboard charts for a phenomenal 110 weeks. It quickly became the band's first album to be certified gold, and shortly after, it achieved multi-platinum status, selling millions of copies across the globe. The financial impact was immediate and dramatic. It pulled Casablanca Records back from the terrifying abyss of bankruptcy almost overnight. Neil Bogart suddenly had the massive influx of cash he needed to not only pay off his crippling debts, but to heavily invest in other artists, eventually turning Casablanca into the most dominant disco label of the late 70s, launching the massive career of Donna Summer. For the band, the album was a complete paradigm shift. They went from struggling to pay their rent and desperately opening for other acts to becoming the absolute biggest, highest-grossing headlining act in America. The album transformed them from a weird underground cult phenomenon into mainstream pop culture icons. They built a massive merchandising empire, selling everything from lunchboxes to comic books printed with their own blood. The illusion created in Electric Lady Studios had successfully manifested an incredible, undeniable reality. The manufactured sound of their ultimate victory actually brought that victory into existence. It was one of the most successful self-fulfilling prophecies in the history of the entertainment business. For decades, the band and the producers fiercely guarded their secret. They vehemently denied the persistent industry rumors that the album was heavily doctored, insisting to journalists and fans alike that the incredible audio was simply a testament to their raw power as a live act. It wasn't until many years later, in deeply reflective autobiographies and retrospective television documentaries, that the participants finally came clean and admitted the sheer, staggering extent of the studio trickery. But by then, the absolute truth no longer mattered to the millions of fans whose lives had been fundamentally changed by the record. The revelation sparked a massive, fascinating philosophical debate within the music community that continues to this day. Does the technical authenticity of a live recording actually matter if the emotional impact it delivers is completely genuine? The album successfully captured the absolute essence of what the band represented, the dangerous, thrilling spirit of a 1970s rock concert, even if it had to literally fake the physical notes to do it. It fundamentally redefined the entire concept of the live album. In its massive, earth-shattering wake, the music industry completely changed its approach. Subsequent blockbuster live albums from other massive artists, records that defined the era and sold millions of copies, quietly followed the exact same secret blueprint, utilizing heavy studio overdubs to fix mistakes and polish the raw performances before releasing them to an unsuspecting public. The precedent was permanently set. Looking back at the incredible, highly unlikely saga of this specific album, it stands as a towering, complex monument to the enduring power of myth-making in rock and roll. The musicians and the visionary producers involved understood a fundamental, deeply psychological truth about the entertainment business. People do not buy tickets or records for absolute, unvarnished documentary realism. They buy them for the magic. They buy them to feel something larger than themselves. In 1975, a group of desperate men facing total financial ruin walked into a darkened room in New York City and meticulously crafted a perfect, beautiful lie. And that lie was so incredibly powerful, so perfectly engineered, and so deeply resonant with the angst and energy of a generation that it completely transcended its own artificial origins. It became a cultural touchstone, a permanent, indelible part of rock history, and a soundtrack for millions of lives. It proved that sometimes the most authentic experiences are the ones that are the most carefully constructed. It is a story of survival, of incredible audio engineering ingenuity, and of a time when the sheer will to succeed was powerful enough to rewrite history in real time. The history of music is filled with these incredible hidden stories. The glossy surface of the records we love often hides a chaotic, desperate, and endlessly fascinating reality of technical trickery, financial gambles, and brilliant deception. If you love deep, unrelenting dives into the untold, authentic stories of music history, the closely guarded secrets the industry tried desperately to hide, and the real human struggles behind the towering myths of pop culture, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. We uncover the real, unvarnished stories behind the biggest legends every single week, separating the facts from the fiction. Don't miss out on the next massive revelation. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue to pull back the curtain on the greatest stories ever told.